Today's lesson is about integer operations, and integer operations cover adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, which are our operations, of integers, which are positive and negative numbers. So there's two kind of definitions that would go with integer operations. As we look at our foldable today, just pay attention to where the information is being recorded so that you have enough room to write some notes. We will be adding some notes over to the side about the law of large numbers. So it's important to have room to do that. As you go, we're going to start with the operation all the way to the left-hand side. And the operations are going to include addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And then the signs that we're discussing are whether or not the numbers are positive or negative. So as I lift up the flaps, we should be writing on the inside of all the flaps. Let's start with addition. The addition property with positive and negative numbers has three different options. You can have two numbers that are both positive. You can have two numbers that are negative, or you can have a positive number and a negative number. The positive number and the negative number can switch orders, so you can also see something along these lines. In terms of the process, when you have a positive number and you're adding it to a positive number, your answer is, of course, going to be positive. So this is pretty straightforward, but just as kind of a general note, positives plus positives equal positives. Same goes with negative numbers. A negative number plus a negative number equals a negative number. The tricky part comes in when we start talking about combining positives and negatives. So if I have one positive number and one negative number, to determine whether the answer is positive or negative, I need to know which of these two numbers is larger, or what value is greater. If, for example, my positive number is larger, then my answer is going to be positive. However, if my negative number is larger, and I like to put that L around the sign to show me that that's the larger number, then my answer is going to be negative. For example, let's look at one example here. 5 plus negative 2. When I look at those two numbers, the 5 is larger. And since 5 is positive, my answer is going to be a positive number. In order to solve this equation, I have to use the law of large numbers, which tells me that I take the larger number, I subtract the smaller number, and I keep the sign of the larger number. In this case, that would be 5 minus 2 equals 3. Another example would say 7 plus negative 9. The negative 9 is my larger value, so my answer is going to be negative. However, I'm still going to start with the large number, which is 9, and subtract the smaller number, which is 7. So my answer is negative 2. Both of these problems really demonstrate the law of large numbers. So let's look at that. The law of large numbers is for adding and subtracting integers. And like I mentioned before, let's take an example problem. 23 plus negative 12. Step 1 would be to say which is larger. Well, that's the 23. So the 23 is going to go on the top of my subtraction problem, while the 12 goes on the bottom. My answer is also going to be positive because that's the sign of the larger number. 23 minus 12, 3 minus 2 is 1, 2 minus 1 is 1. So my answer is positive 11. The key to realizing the law of large numbers is to keep in mind which number is larger, which is farther away from 0. That'll help us to account for the number line. If I want to check my answer, if I'm starting all the way at positive 23, and I'm down here at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, right? If I'm going to travel negative 12, that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I'm going to end right up at that positive 11 point. So I know that my answer is correct. Let's move on to subtraction. In terms of subtraction problems, we are also going to use the law of large numbers. And instead of looking at a negative sign as a negative sign, we're going to look at it as a subtraction. The only tricky part in terms of subtracting integers is that a double negative actually means the opposite of a negative number. We talked about this a little bit in class, where if I have two negatives, or I'm subtracting a negative number, that instinctually you would like to add. So if I was going to write out all of my signs, I would start with a positive and a positive, a negative and a negative, and then of course a positive and a negative, just like we did before. When subtracting a positive number minus a positive number, most chances are I'm going to get a positive number, especially if the first number is larger than the second. However, if I'm subtracting a positive from a positive and my second number is larger, my answer is going to be negative. These are both instances in which the law of large numbers would help. Same holds true for negative numbers. Negative minus a negative depends on which number is larger. If the first number is larger and I'm minusing a negative number, my answer is going to be negative. However, if my second number is larger, my answer is going to be positive. Mixing positives with negatives only has two scenarios. A positive minus a negative is equal to a positive, and a negative minus a positive is equal to a negative. When in doubt, please use the law of large numbers, especially for subtraction. Addition or subtraction will always work, but subtraction has more variables, so it's important to practice. Let's look at some examples. Seven minus 4 equals 3. However, 4 minus 7 equals negative 3. That's an example of how two positive numbers can still give you a negative answer. Negative 5 minus negative 2 would equal negative 3. But negative 2 minus negative 5 equals 3. Again, law of large numbers. I can see that the 5 is larger than the 2. So when I subtract, I'm left over with 3. Another note you might want to keep in mind is that whenever you have two negatives in a row, you're actually saying what is the opposite of a negative. This is truly a positive number. So when I say negative 2 minus negative 5, I'm really saying negative 2 plus 5. And in that case, the larger value is 5, and my answer will be positive because my 5 is of positive value. As we move on, multiplication and division are very similar, and they're really great in terms of remembering your strategies. There's two ways to really multiply and divide positives and negative numbers. One way is to use what we call the sleepy man. And the sleepy man looks like this. He almost looks like a peace sign. And he has two sleepy eyes. And his mouth is kind of pursed, right? And the reason for the sleepy man is that it helps you to identify whether your answer is going to be positive or negative. You're always going to multiply and divide just the way you normally do. So 5 times 2 is 10. Negative 5 times negative 2 is 10. Negative 5 times 2 is negative 10. You're always going to multiply. So the answer is always going to be the same. However, determining whether the answer will be positive or negative, you can use the sleepy man. So if my 5 is positive and my 2 is negative, then my answer is going to be negative. That's the last sign left in my sleepy man. I can do it any way possible. If I have a negative number multiplied by a negative number, my answer has to be a positive number because that's the last symbol left in the sleepy man. The only symbols that we don't account for are if we're doing two positive numbers that we're multiplying, because obviously you should know that the answer is going to be positive. One other way to help you remember multiplication and division of positive and negative numbers is to relate positive numbers to love and to relate negative numbers to hate. So, if you had a positive number times a positive number, then you love to love, so you're going to love. If you have a positive number times a negative number, then you love to hate, so you're a hater. If you have a negative number times a positive number, then you hate love, so you're still a hater. Or if you have a negative number and a negative number, then you hate to hate, so you love. That's another cool memory trick to help remember positive and negative numbers in terms of multiplication and division. The addition and subtraction will come in practice, and we will really spend a lot of time reviewing those processes. But so just review your notes and try too hard not to stress out or feel like it makes sense or it's a little confusing. It will all come, and we'll spend a lot of time on this in class.